So then I guess I'll get started. I'm Jossie Haines. I'm the Senior Director of Platform Engineering at Tile. And today I really want to chat with you about engineering with empathy. And, when I first signed up to give this talk, I had no idea how important this topic would be, given, current events going on today in the US and around the world. And I really had time to reflect over the last couple of weeks on how much empathy I have as somebody who actually talks about this, and how I can really be a better ally to my Black colleagues and friends who are struggling, heartbroken, and exhausted. And I actually had to admit to myself that when the protests started, I actually had thought, hey, why are people looting and rioting? Why is everything not peaceful? And, I reflected, and I actually watched a Trevor Noah video on YouTube about where he took the time to talk about how the social contract has been broken for Black Americans on a daily basis. And they're living in fear. And I realized I hadn't been taken into account this difference of perspective, and I needed to apply more empathy there. And I also realized, this difference of perspective isn't just what we need to be listening to, but it's what we need to be taking action on when we're building technology. Because let's be honest, even though technology is impacting all aspects of our daily lives, it wasn't actually built to help everyone equally. Some of the challenges are voice assistants are less accurate with female voices, as well as for those without accents. Facial recognition software does not work as well with people with darker skin tones. And there's a lot of bias in the underlying data that's being used by the machine learning algorithms that power a lot of this technology. And inherent bias is present in our company cultures in the tech industry. That's why we have a revolving door of diverse candidates. In the last 20 years, companies have spent billions of dollars in diversity and inclusion, but the numbers really haven't moved much. And at the end of the day, why would you want to stay in a career if you're constantly being discriminated against? And, it's usually not a big event or an overt occurrence. As I'm sure a lot of you know, it's usually death by 1,000 paper cuts, having your ideas appropriated, being spoken over, being passed up for promotion, being assumed to be non-technical when you're actually in a technical role. Despite having been an engineering director for many years, people still assume I'm a project manager when I show up to partner meetings sometimes. But what we really need to be instead doing is creating cultures of belonging, where diverse team members can not just exist, but where their ideas and opinions are heard and acted upon, and they can actually thrive. And to create these cultures of belonging, we have to embrace empathy and take action on it. And today I really want to focus on empathy through the lens of an engineering team. And a lot of times engineers are really focused on growing their technical skills, but I think empathy can be one of the most valuable tools an engineer can have. Empathy can be learned, and it's actually something you can get better at with daily practice. As an engineer, how many times are you giving feedback to not just your other peers, but, on product documents and designs as well, or figuring out what features are most important to focus on and build? All of those things can actually be accomplished more effectively and successfully by looking at them through the lens of empathy. And I keep talking about empathy, but I haven't taken the time to define it. So I want to start there. And one of my favorite definitions of empathy comes from Brené Brown, who's a shame and vulnerability researcher. And, she defines it as really being made up of 4 components. The first one is being able to see the world as others see it. As engineers, can we take the time to see the world through the lens of all of our potential customers and our diverse coworkers? And, can we be learning about their cultures and challenges to do this more effectively? The second one is being non-judgmental. It's easy to point fingers and play the blame game. Hey, we even have a command, get blame, to figure out, who committed a certain line of code. But what if instead of blaming others and shaming them, we assume that, hey, our colleagues are trying to deliver their best. And maybe there's a reason they did things a certain way. And what if we instead treat everything with curiosity instead of jumping the gun? The third one is really understanding another person's feelings. And engineers kind of get weird with me when I talk about feelings, but you're not building code in a vacuum. You're interacting with other human beings day in and day out. And not only do your colleagues have feelings, your customers have feelings too. And if you don't understand them, it's going to be harder to build an effective product, as well as how to effectively collaborate with your team. And finally, number 4 is being able to communicate your understanding of that person's feelings back to them. To be able to have a constructive discussion, you have to do this. And a lot of arguments could be avoided if we just acknowledge somebody else's feelings. That doesn't mean you have to admit that it's right, but a lot of times people just need to feel understood. And especially if you want somebody to change something or provide them feedback, if they don't feel heard, there's no way they're going to accept it. And of course, having empathy isn't in and of itself enough. You have to take action on it. And hey, that's actually also the hard part. So today I actually wanted to talk about practical things that you can do right away after this session. And so we're going to talk about applying empathy to code reviews, as well as other engineering practices and processes. So hey, we can all work towards creating this culture of belonging and hey, build more inclusive products. And before I dive into some of the more explicit examples of empathy within engineering, I'd like to start with something that I think is the cornerstone of empathy, and it's active listening. So take a moment and reflect in maybe the last 24 hours. How many times have you had a conversation in a meeting and you are either not fully listening or halfway through somebody saying something, you were already formulating your response and you didn't really listen to the second half of their sentence? What are your triggers that get you distracted? Especially with being remote now, it's easy to get distracted by Slack notifications. There's, other people, emailing you. So I try to turn off all my notifications during meetings so I can fully be present. And so take a moment and hey, maybe take it as a challenge for the next 24 hours. See if you can fully be an active listener in all of your meetings. But as I said, I wanted to dig into how empathy applies for engineers. So let's start with code reviews. And so when I went to create the slides for the talk, I wanted to find an example of a code review that lacked empathy. And, to provide so I could have a star counter example. And I landed on this example from Linus Torvald. Anybody who thinks that the above is A, legible, B, efficient, C, particularly safe, is just incompetent and out to lunch. And actually, this is just a small subsection of a much larger rant that included cursing that I did not include. And of course, you might say, hey, this is an extreme example, and you'd never write anything like this. However, how many of you have started a sentence and are guilty of saying, why didn't you? I'm sure I have at least once or twice when I've been frustrated. Why didn't you remove this variable? Why didn't you just return here? But I know I don't feel good being on the receiving end of a why didn't you statement. So I doubt our colleagues are either. And so what if the reviewer instead said something like, hey, I don't see the variable XYZ being used elsewhere in the code. Should it be removed? And, a code reviewer's main objective isn't to be right and have the person who wrote the code be wrong. It's about providing suggestions and being curious about the ways to improve the code to create a better product. And the code may not be perfect or up to your expectations, and that could be because of constraints the developer faced. And, it could be anything from time to sheer unrealistic expectations to, anything going on right now. And as a reviewer, if we take the time to dig into what some of those constraints are, it allows us to have more empathy in the reason the code may be written the way it is. And I think we should really treat code reviews as a learning experience for both the reviewer and the creator. And, I've been talking about empathy from the side of the code reviewer, but it's also on the person who wrote the code as well. And I know once I've been done with writing my code and tested it and I'm about to create my PR, I usually just want to get it shipped and move on to my next thing. But you have to remember, your colleagues who are going to review your code didn't just go through the last couple months of coding and gotchas and meetings with you. And so they need context if you want them to be most effective at reviewing your code. So, make sure you're creating good PR descriptions with links to PRDs and architecture documents. I tell everybody to think of it as a fact-finding mission. If in a year or two, you and somebody in your team had to fix a bug, could you look at that PR and actually be able to find interesting gotchas in there? Hey, pull requests can also become great artifacts for future history. And, you can apply this to more than just code reviews. You can apply this to the whole development process. For your code commit messages in GitHub, they can have useful descriptions that actually say what was in the commit. If we applied this, we could have better documentation where you could much more easily onboard new developers, as well as the fact with us being remote now, having more documentation will actually empower a lot more collaboration. And, I've been focusing on feedback within code reviews, but, engineers are constantly giving feedback, not just to other engineers, but, cross-functional team members as well who may not be as technical. We have to align on product requirements documents, architectures, UX designs, and schedules. And you can apply empathy to all of these situations to actually make them more collaborative. And, the engineers that I know who can collaborate the best are the ones who, do take the time to think with empathy and think, hey, how do I need to explain these things successfully to my non-technical colleagues? And, there's this triangle and balance between engineering, design, and product. And healthy tension is always great. But I also have seen this sometimes degrade into unproductive discussions, where people are speaking at each other instead of listening. But, what if instead, when you notice that about to start happening, instead of being frustrated and triggered and digging in, you stop and think with empathy about the other person, right? At work, at the end of the day, all of you are trying to create an amazing product to hopefully fulfill your customers' needs. And so can you align on that goal and see each other's differences, or just two sides of the same coin? And so one of the last areas I want to focus on today is, how empathy is really needed to create the products that fulfill the needs of our diverse world. And, I started with this as well. And I think that even back-end engineers should have an opportunity to talk to customers, read their feedback, and really understand their challenges. By having empathy for what the customer's needs are and how those might be different from our own, it can actually change how we write our code, what the UX looks like, or even what features we provide. And we need to take the time to do that by looking at their perspective, emotion, and, like I said, withholding judgment. And while I've been talking mainly about customers here, this applies to our diverse colleagues as well. Hiring diverse team members is what's going to provide us different perspectives that we may not be aware of. And if we take the time to truly understand and appreciate those, we can build better products that not just account for, but actually fulfill the needs of our diverse world. And what I've covered is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to applying empathy to engineering. I haven't delved into leading with empathy, how empathy can be applied to meetings. There's a lot of different topics around empathy I could get into, but those have to be another topic for another day because there's only so much I can cover in 20 minutes. But if you want to know more, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. But I want to finish with empathy is a skill. And like I said, we can get better at it with time and daily practice. So I'm going to implore each of you who are listening to me today to take some time to reflect on some of the things I shared and maybe take one thing you learned and apply it, but not just today, a little bit every day. So after the session, pull out your calendars and schedule 15 minutes every day to see how you can maybe apply more empathy in your daily life. By engineering with empathy, we can create more effective teams that produce better products, as well as providing a space where diverse team members can thrive. And I think empathy and taking action on it is one of the things that'll lead us to the companies of the future that can truly create the technology that fulfills the needs of our diverse population. And hey, as the current events in the world show, that's a future we need today more than ever. Thank you. All right, does anybody have any questions? We have like 1 minute or two. Yes, feel free to type any questions you have in the chat. Help people be less personally attached to their code. Yes. I think one of the things somebody said to me is when you're writing code review comments, think about it as being a copywriter, right? And try to think about, and instead of and try to think about things from like a second person point of view. And so it's all about not like you wrote this bug, but hey, I saw this issue in this code. And so, yeah, I think it's really about I think people get attached to their code because they created it. And, this is a creative expression for them. But I think it's also an opportunity to, hey, be willing to be more vulnerable and create a culture of vulnerability. All right, the last question is, okay, you show empathy to your subordinates and your boss calls you weak for it. How do you continue to show empathy? Well, first I have to say I'm sorry that your boss calls you weak for showing empathy because, showing empathy is not a sign of weakness. and truly to be creating, like I said, these companies of the future that are going to fulfill the needs of our diverse world and, get us to be an anti-racist society. We need to be showing empathy. So I don't know if you can talk to other people in your leadership team about empathy and see if, other people within your company also value empathy, and you can make it kind of a grassroots effort. So then it's not just your boss against you. And time is up right now, I think. And so it was great getting a chance to chat with all of you. And if you have any more questions, like I said, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.